You know, the book of Ecclesiastes, which is our study right now on Sunday mornings, it's a really difficult book to divide up into smooth flowing segments. And sometimes it's really hard to see how the writer transitions from one section to another. And the way that I have arranged today's text may seem odd to you. It probably is. But I hope it will make sense after you've seen the overall picture that I want to develop today. The text is Ecclesiastes chapter 4, beginning in verse 13. And we're going to read through chapter 5 and verse 9. We'll have the verses up on the screen, I believe. So let's just start and let's read this text. Better a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer knows how to heed a warning. The youth may have come from prison to the kingship, or he may have been born in poverty within his kingdom. I saw that all who lived and walked under the sun followed the youth, the king's successor. There was no end to all the people who were before him. But those who came later were not pleased with the successor. This too is meaningless and a chasing after wind. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Go near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools who do not know that they do wrong. Do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God. God is in heaven and you are on earth, so let your words be few. A dream comes when there are many cares, and many words mark the speech of a fool. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to fulfill it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. It's better not to make a vow than to make one and not fulfill it. Do not let your mouth lead you into sin, and do not protest to the temple messenger, "Oh, my vow was a mistake." Why should God be angry at what you say and destroy the work of your hands? Much dreaming and many words are meaningless. Therefore, fear God. If you see the poor oppressed in a district and justice and rights denied, don't be surprised at such things. For one official is eyed by a higher one, and over them both are others higher still. The increase from the land is taken by all. The king himself profits from the fields. Interesting place maybe to stop and an interesting division of a text. But let me explain how I see this right now. The first paragraph of the text, which is chapter 4, verses 13 through 16, is very obscure. In fact, almost all the commentators that I read mention how hard it is to understand what Kohelet is saying at this point. But I do believe it points to something that we are all familiar with, and that is the short-lived popularity of the rich and the famous and the powerful. Here's the picture that I see being drawn in that paragraph. Kohelet begins with this old king. He's been in the saddle way too long. He's foolish. He's out of touch with the times, out of touch with his people. He has forgotten what it's like to be young and full of vim and vigor. So you have that king. And then it so happens that a younger, better man takes his place. And this young man may have arisen out of poverty. He may even have come out of prison, but he has a following, at least for a while. But he too will go the way of the former king, as those who come later in verse 16 were not pleased with the successor. Time, familiarity, and the restlessness of humans eventually pushes him out and brings in another. And the point to me of that paragraph is that life, even for the great and even for the powerful, is very uncertain. Because of the fickle nature of people, nobody's position is secure, not even the king's. Now, let's look at the last paragraph I read. That's chapter 5, verses 8 and 9. And here, Kohelet turns again to the issue of oppression. He touched on that back in chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. And here he talks about oppression. Now, folks, oppression is not just a matter of individuals behaving badly toward each other. That happens, but that's really not the issue. Oppression has a structured, systemic origin. Denial of justice, the denial of rights, is the consequence of an entire bureaucratic system that is corrupt. Every official is eyed by somebody higher up the line, higher up the ladder than he is, and every official must act in a way that will benefit and please his superior. And at the very top is the king. The New Living Translation renders verse 9 like this: even the king milks the land for his own profit. Has there ever been a more contemporary picture than this one? Even in our own system, it can be almost impossible for the average, ordinary person to obtain justice because her case can be and often is obstructed and deflected from one bureaucrat, one department to another. Every official can blame the system or blame somebody over him or blame somebody beneath him. And the ultimate authorities live at such a great distance from the lives they affect that they're virtually useless in obtaining justice and our rights. Those two paragraphs are like bookends that enclose the main point of the text. They reveal the truth that on one hand, neither the rich or the powerful, or on the other hand, the poor and the lowly, can rely on the human factor. You cannot put your trust in human beings or in human systems. Kings can be overthrown. They can be deposed simply by the fickleness of the people. And the poor are constantly trampled by a corrupt system. Two bookends saying nobody is secure. So what's at the center of the passage? God is. On whom do we rely? On God. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 7 is the center point of this. And in that, the writer turns to the worship of God. God is to be the focal point of our worship and of our lives, not the self. The Word of God must take priority, not the words of the worshiper. And when in chapter 5, verse 1, where Kohelet speaks of going to the house of God, to me, he's obviously talking about the temple. And he's talking about temple worship or the temple ritual. Now, you know me. I'm greatly aware, and I have often taught the truth, that there's a real sense in which everything we do as believers is our acceptable worship. Romans chapter 12, verse 1. Everything we do, your job, you're going to school, the leisure, all of it should be worship to God. I understand that. But it's also true, as Sherry said a moment ago, that when we gather together, as we are right now, we are here for a very special purpose. We are here to glorify and praise and honor God together. Yes, we are uplifted and we are encouraged and we're built up by coming together. And that's another thing that happens here. But we come together to worship God. This is a very special thing that happens. So I want to apply the words mainly to this particular situation, to the assembly of God's people for the purpose of worship. I think it goes beyond that, but I'd like to really focus on that. So there are some things that the writer of Ecclesiastes tells us we need to do when we come to the house of God, when we gather together. Number one, guard your steps. Guard your steps when you come together for worship. And to me, that means we must worship in reverence. I think he may be alluding to Moses at the burning bush when God said, take off your sandals because the ground you're standing on is holy ground. Exodus 3:5. Watch your steps, Moses. This is holy ground. And that may be an allusion. And he's saying to us, watch your steps when you come into the house of God. And I'm not saying this building is the house of God, but I'm saying that we together are the temple. We together as a congregation are the temple of God. We are the house of God. Watch your steps, folks, when you come together. Secondly, we are to go near to listen. Go near to listen and not to offer the sacrifice of fools. And that refers to those who perform the rituals of worship without any intention of ever bringing the whole self before God in an attitude of reverence and awe. The sacrifice of fools is the careless observance of religious ritual. And to use a more modern phrase, it's just going through the motions without any preparation, without any thought given, without any conviction. The wise, godly person comes before God carefully because that person knows that God is really God. Or as Hale puts it, God is in heaven and we are merely earth-bound creatures. We are on earth. How foolish to think that we can somehow manipulate God, that we can somehow control God with our words. Jesus recognized that error. Remember the warning that he gave? He said, when you pray, don't keep on babbling like the pagans who think they'll be heard because of their many words. That's Matthew chapter 6, verse 7. Here are people who thought they could somehow manipulate God or their God with their words. And I wonder if Christians don't sometimes do the same thing. If I can just keep on talking, if I can say the right words, God will have to listen to me. How foolish. Kohelet's advice is simple. When you come before God, come to listen and let your words be few. And this is a message I think we so desperately need to hear in our time, because we're part of a culture of noise. Are we not? A culture of noise. If it's not the traffic on the roads, it's people chattering or music playing. Are you like me? It is really nice to go to a restaurant every now and then where music isn't playing. Sometimes you go to a place you can't even talk to the people across the table because somebody thinks we got to have noise. And it's really nice to go sometimes where there's no music being played. And in our homes, TV's blaring. You know, a lot of times people turn on the TV, they're not even watching it. It's the noise that they want. It's the comfort of the noise. And if it's not the TV, we're listening to iTunes or we're listening to something on our laptops. In our cars, the radio is blaring or a CD's playing or we're blabbing on the cell phone or we're texting. And even in our church gatherings, we are scared to death of silence. We are frightened of silence, and there's very little opportunity for us together to sit in silent awe in the presence of God, because we just have to constantly be doing something, saying something. I know there are churches where they have instrumental music that during the prayer they're playing. You know, there's always something going on. We really need to hear the message of Ecclesiastes. I think as a society, we are virtually incapable of knowing what it means, what we just sang. Be still and know that I am God, Psalm 46:10. I think we're virtually incapable of doing that. And noise can deafen us to reality. We have to have times, folks, of silent reflection. We have to have times of deliberate inactivity if we're to regain our perspective and to remember it all, who God is and what He's done for us. And in order to do that, there are times when we just need to stop talking and listen to Him. Now in chapter 5, verse 3, the writer mentions dreams. Dreams come with many cares, he says. Charles Swindoll says that he's talking about daydreaming. And Derek Kidner, in his little commentary, agrees, and he says that these dreams, and I like this quote, these dreams appear to be daydreams reducing worship to verbal doodling. Some of you doing that right now? You just doodling through this time, you know, just mind going every which direction? Daydreaming your way through the assembly, daydreaming your way through a time when we should be listening to God, when we should be worshiping God. Kohelet's advice is stop daydreaming and listen quietly and listen calmly to what God is saying. And then in chapter 5, verses 4 through 7, he takes up a slightly different and yet related subject. That is making vows before God, or making vows or promises to God. We must be careful to keep our mouths under control, or it can lead to sin when our actions are not consistent with our words. And he says that we are to keep the vows and to keep the promises that we make. And again, what a message for our time, because we live in a day and age of shallow and superficial commitments. To many people, a vow or a promise is little more than kind of a casual hope that they might do what they've said that they would do. But not so with God. He says, when you make a vow, you keep it. And you may have noticed when Kohelet says, don't protest to the temple messenger, he seems to be suggesting that when someone comes, in his case from the temple, to remind you of your vow, and perhaps collect what you vowed to give, he says, don't sin by saying, oh, I know I promised I'd do that, but I can't do it. It was a mistake for me to do that. Don't do that. Don't go there. We know what he's talking about. On many occasions, I have heard somebody say, it was really a mistake when I got married. I was too young to know what I was doing, and I just can't keep that promise anymore. I just didn't know what I was doing. And I've heard people say, well, I just didn't think this through. I shouldn't have committed myself to that project or to that ministry or to that work, especially since it's so time-consuming and it's exhausting. Or that promise, it's just kind of a youthful mistake. I'm not going to keep it. Now, it's perfectly all right to never make a vow. It's perfectly all right, the writer says, to never make a promise. But once we do, God expects us to fulfill it. And you can't argue that, well, if I do this, it's really going to hurt. It's really going to cost me. Do you remember the convincing words of Psalm 15? If you don't, let me remind you. Psalm 15, verse 1, Lord, who may dwell in your sanctuary? Who may live on your holy hill? And then the writer says several things. Those who are blameless, those who speak the truth. And then in verse 4, he says, here's who can live in your sanctuary. Here's who can live on your holy hill. He who keeps his oath even when it hurts. It isn't a matter of making a promise and then saying, well, that's going to hurt me. That's going to cost me. No, he says God really approves of those who keep their word even when it hurts. Now finally, I'd like you to look at the end of chapter 5, verse 7. Therefore, he says, fear God. That's the center of the whole book, as far as I'm concerned. Not the literal or the physical center, but the theological center. The book ends on the same note. You all know the famous ending of Ecclesiastes. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind, chapter 12, verse 13. So he kind of ends, but I think this is the center. Fear God. Stand in awe of God. And when I think of fearing God, it means to me that I take him seriously. That I don't try to play games with him. And whatever he says, I will do my best to do it. And folks, if we're ever going to develop deeper and more meaningful worship together, and even privately, but if that's ever going to happen, it's not going to be because we're going to sing new and exciting songs or bring in more dynamic speakers or have some awesome light show or do anything like that. I'm not saying those are bad things to do, but it's not going to happen because of that. We will develop deeper worship when we come together in absolute awe and respect and fear and reverence for God. Fear God. That's what it's all about. And when you come into his presence, come to listen. Don't be quick to speak. Don't be quick to make vows. Just come to hear and to worship and to stand in awe of this one who is our God.